All right. Welcome, everybody. I am here with Kyle Thompson, and today we are going to be talking about the ought implies can principle and some experimental philosophical work that's been done on that. So let's just get into it. Kyle, would you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, all that stuff?
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. This is, I love what you're doing here. Also, amazing intro. Yeah, so my name's Kyle Thompson. Some of this I think will inform our later conversation because you're interested in psychology and philosophy. And I think many of us that have those dual interests find like there are disciplines that kind of like sit across both lines, but a lot of us ended up in a psychology program, even though we're also deeply interested in philosophy and vice versa. So I ended up doing my PhD in philosophy, but that was after doing an undergraduate degree in psychology. And so I had that background. And I initially went to grad school at Claremont Graduate University in positive psychology, which is like studying well-being and happiness and the positive affect, the stuff that often gets historically left out, or this is their kind of like the way they think of themselves. And in that, I realized that my interest in positive psychology looked a lot like, moral psychology and moral philosophy and ethics. And I just didn't know that name for it. So once I hit the philosophy side of things and started taking those classes, I'd already been reading philosophy. I really just didn't know the name for it. I didn't know that's what I was doing. I went in that direction, but I guess I didn't get totally away from the psychology side because I ended up doing my dissertation, and a lot of my work and research is in experimental philosophy, which roughly takes the methods and practices of contemporary psychology, running studies to get people's judgments using surveys and other interventions to look at traditionally philosophical questions. And so I'm currently at Harvey Mudd College, which is across the street from Claremont Graduate University. So I've been in Claremont for over a decade now, and I enjoy teaching philosophy. I do a course on empirical and experimental philosophy. I love that I can like bring these conversations into a course. And then my research, when time allows, focuses on just how folks think about philosophical ideas and how we can use the methods of cog-sci and psychology to get at that.
Awesome. Well, so the plan was to talk about the ought implies can stuff, but I also want this to be more open-ended and that leads me because I didn't know you taught a course on experimental philosophy in particular.
Yeah, so I called it empirical and experimental philosophy, and the idea was if experimental philosophy is 20 plus years old as a movement, like this is in the history of philosophy very new, even though that word experimental philosophy has been used in other in historic ways. But this recent movement where whatever you'd find in a contemporary psychology journal studying people's like judgments and decision making and moral psychology, those methods being applied to philosophy, that's very new. But I thought like wouldn't it be interesting to kind of look thematically at the history of philosophy in terms of when the empirical connected with or challenged or put in tension with something like robustly philosophical. So we do kind of, maybe we start roughly with Descartes, and he's someone that's very dismissive of empirical observation as the foundation of our knowledge. And then you have someone like Hume that seems like really grounded in an empiricist notion. And if these are our kind of like two broad thematic views throughout the history of philosophy, let's look at some stopover points. So for example, we read William Paley on understanding design and nature, and then we look at Darwin's contributions. And like it's moments like these where clearly empirical observations, what's coming out of, quote, the sciences, informs our philosophizing in unavoidable ways. And so we look at a few moments in the history of philosophy that way, and then we land at the end in this experimental philosophy moment. And, we're saying, oh, it's still to this day, the sciences and what they're up to, their methods are informing what the philosopher is doing. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Probably a little of both. What's the limitations there? And the students at Harvey Mudd, I think, really like this. It's a STEM focused school. And so if I'm telling them that, there's like a science approach to philosophy, that immediately is interesting and like, oh, that's not what they associate with that. By the end of it, we really interrogate whether we want to call this science, what role the empirical has in affecting how we think about philosophical problems. Is it overstated, understated? So it's a really great conversation. And I think it's immediately interesting to someone that you might, they know the trolley problem. It's like, well, what if I told you people are running studies to see how people's judgments form around that, which might go into how we theorize about moral philosophy. And if that gets them in the door, then there's this rich conversation underneath that we have throughout the semester.
We're back. So the next thing I wanted to ask you about is how this class has gone down with the students, like how have they received it? And to give some context for kind of what I'm getting at with this is that when I was an undergrad, I took courses in philosophy and I took courses in psychology, but I never really took any courses that fused the two and presented them to me in that framework. The only exposure I had to this experimental philosophy interdisciplinary approach was in the actual journal articles themselves. And I never got to see it in action in a course. And I feel like I kind of missed out. But I could also imagine students, having, if they're signing up for the class, maybe they already know what they're in for. But I could see some people wondering at the relevance or how to utilize it or what to do with it. So that should hopefully give a bit of context. And then, you could just let me know, like what has been the reception, how have students responded to this?
Yeah, I think the reception has been really positive, and I think there's a few things that makes this course like a good fit for Harvey Mudd. I think for someone that is interested in science and applying that to diverse questions, just immediately the idea is interesting that we might take on disciplines in like philosophy that deal with value and logic and critical thinking, and somehow combine that with the methodologies of the social sciences. I think is immediately interesting to those students in a way that very much explains why maybe someone that comes from a philosophy background in specific and is less interested in science might be more resistant. So experimental philosophy, as you know, for many folks in philosophy seems like the wrong approach. Like, what are you trying to do answering philosophical questions, calling on anything that looks vaguely scientific? I think if they open themselves up to what's going on and viewed it, as you talked about in your discussion with Nobe, it's not about resolving these on the basis of surveys that you're administering. I think they would find a lot of richness in the conversation XFI experimental philosophy supplies. But I think for students that are, pro science, generally speaking, they're like, wow, this is a good way for me to see myself in there. I think the other thing that makes it a real fun and engaging class is like, I basically just get to go through all the greatest hits, right? So it's like, here's the Nobe effect, or not to bring out the full thought experiment, but you have these thought experiments that like, you can give half the class one version of it and the other half another version, and there's only slight variations. And then you ask them what they think, and they have completely different responses. And then immediately you could have this conversation like, oh, intentional action might be informed by our moral judgments, like the trolley problem, looking at Jonathan Haidt's work on, intuitions first and reflection later, and looking how Railton complicates that. Like all of those like greatest hits thought experiments are basically front and center in the class. And so you got to go through them, and it's immediately interactive, because it's almost like you are a participant in one of these studies. And let's be honest, a lot of what makes XFI fun and thought experiments fun is it's like you're writing a little fiction, you're writing a little narrative, and you've embedded the the medicine in the peanut butter. You're trying to see how someone takes this philosophical idea. It's just fun to write these fictions. It's fun to give them out, and they get people talking. There's a reason the trolley problem is immediately captivating. So I think a lot of it is just the intersections are naturally, it says recording error. It says your device is out of storage and your recordings have stopped.
Yeah, that's on your end. So
okay.
Yeah, don't worry about it on my end.
Sorry, I just saw a red light. Okay, so I'll wrap out the other part. So yeah, so I think being able to go through these the canon of fun thought experiments that experimental philosophers use, and just they're great. Gettier cases, and like they all just are immediately gripping. I might have something to do with it. I'm pretty passionate about it, and so we all have a good time and great discussions.
So yeah, you bring up. So I was interested in how students react to it, but you actually moved into exactly what I wanted to ask about next, which is the general philosophical reception towards experimental philosophy. So
yeah,
I'll ask you about your experiences, but I could say a little bit about my own experience.
Yeah.
So, I did philosophy and psychology as an undergrad. When I went to grad school, the first time I did it twice, which I don't know if that's a great idea. So I first started with a philosophy graduate program, and there was a broad spread of attitudes towards experimental philosophy. This was 2012, so it was only about a decade since the inception of this like modern experimental philosophy. And there was quite often the attitude was pretty ambivalent or even negative, like quite negative in some cases.
Yeah.
With some people saying that they don't really regard it as philosophy. For me, if I'm trying to answer a certain set of questions, from my point of view, I'm kind of like, why does it matter whether it's philosophy or not? If I'm trying to answer the question, I'll use the tool that works. Like why, I don't care so much about whether my methods fall within the scope of a particular academic, like an institutionalized conception of like, this is what we do in this area with these credentials. If I want to answer a question like, what is morality? And the methods are the methods of anthropology or history or psychology or neuroscience. I don't care. Let's use all of them. So for me, that was some of that attitude I thought it just didn't resonate with me. But some of it seemed to me motivated by more than just a pure philosophical critique, but a kind of almost reflexive hostility. Like, don't touch our turf. Like, what do you think you're doing? Or don't try to change our turf to encompass things I don't want to consider part of it. So that's been my experience. It's continued to be my experience. In fact, this might match some of your experience with suggesting that I think people from a psychology angle seem to have less of an issue with the philosophy side of things than philosophers have with the psychology side of things. When I then went into a psychology department, no one was like, why would you bring philosophy here? It was just, what do you mean by that term? Oh, these are some strange terms. Can you explain them to us? And there was a lot less like just, this is a waste of time. So that wasn't my experience of psychology. But I will say, since then, it has been an uphill battle to find journals. So there are some philosophical journals that don't have any issue publishing work that's kind of at the intersection of the two areas, like philosophical psychology. But a lot of journals, I have a paper that I've been trying to get out there, and I sent it to one journal, and they're like, yeah, that we publish psychology, not so much philosophy. And then, why don't you send it to a philosophy journal? I sent it over to them, and they're like, factor analysis? You should send this to a psychology journal. And where do I send this? So there is a deeper issue here, which is this, the way that the institutions that we have in place for the various disciplines have become like calcified in their methods, their approaches, their norms, their attitudes towards how to do things and what questions to focus on and how to focus on them, to such an extent that the whole sort of structure from undergrad through academic publication and even in the job market, that it's hard to find a place when you work in both areas. So I'm sorry, I said a lot, but I'm wondering what your attitude is towards, I guess, all of that.
No, that was great. Yeah, I have, as with you, I've gotten the response of skepticism, polite skepticism, to something bordering on more academic hostility, nothing actually hostile. And I think it makes sense. Anytime there is someone trying to do something they perceive as different and new, and that it might shake things up. Yeah, I mean, in some sense, like, good. That's if it didn't do that, right? If it wasn't, rustling some feathers, academically speaking, then I'm not sure it would be ambitious enough. And look, like let's say XFi has like a 40-year solid run and ends there. Let's just say let's say people pack up their bags afterwards and think, oh yeah, this is more of psychology, and this doesn't really have a place in the canon of philosophy. I don't think that's going to be the case, by the way. But like, it started a lot of great conversations. It got people to be, I think, self-critical about when they call on their own intuitions in support of their theories and their ideas. I like the, it's not like I'm going out to trigger people, but like, I think that's good that people go, wait a second, am I just relying on a kind of atypical intuition I got because I was trained in a particular way of viewing philosophy? Like, if that's all, quote unquote, all this movement does, then I think that's wonderful. I do think people have, now that it's grown, and the, I always talk about, like, there's kind of like, narrow XFi and maybe a more general XFi, and there's obviously not clean lines, but like something empirically informed and in that kind of more XFi cognitive science approach shows up in conferences. And you're right, there's still not as many journals as I would like that are taking up these ideas, but it's out there, and they're like, there's professional conferences and blogs, and like there's a lot going on in this, that it doesn't seem like the movement was extinguished in its nascency. I think people are saying that for many questions, experimental philosophy has a lot to say. I think the core issue, though, is what someone takes, and I know you mentioned this with Nov, like what someone takes to be the project that they're doing when they're publishing their results. Like, I don't think I've read an XFi paper that says I'm going to resolve this, age-old debate. But there are some that get decently ambitious with how much they've figured out how folks think about, say, free will or knowledge. That's one approach. I think there's a whole area to be explored, and this can connect to the qualitative methods stuff that I know we want to talk about, where it's more, I almost think of it as like a ethnography. I'm not trying to resolve these questions about do we or don't we have free will, who is a compatibilist or not a compatibilist, but I'm just learning. I want to learn how folks think and talk about these issues, how they cut up the world with respect to these issues. Just as I might go into a community to learn about their religious beliefs or their cultural practices, now I'm doing it almost in a, like, let's also bring in their philosophical intuitions and views. So I think that general view of XFi, there's so many places to go. And if someone saw that and was like, oh, well, then that's ethnography, that's sociology, that has no place here. But then I think you've reduced what philosophy is to, like, this very 20th century analytic approach that really doesn't reflect the history of philosophy. So
yeah, I'm on the same page about that. Where I come into the picture on some of these questions is when, like, analytic philosophers doing, sort of, I guess you could say, sort of standard armchair work, like they're not really seeing themselves as doing empirical work or engaged in psychology or sociology or anything like that, will draw on or appeal to what strike me to be empirical claims about how people think. And this comes up in my own work with meta ethics. People will, it's very common to find philosophers say things like ordinary people are moral realists, or ordinary people speak like moral realists, or ordinary people, when they make certain kinds of judgments, they mean this, or they'll say this is the common sense view. Why is it that, they feel entitled to make claims that to me strike me as transparently and, unambiguously empirical claims about human psychology? They'll just make those claims. But then if you say, well, hold up a minute, is that true? Like, we could go out and do a survey. We could conduct research. Like, it might not be as simple as a survey. It might be a whole research program that we might need to embark on to address the sorts of claims that you're making. And often it's not like, so it's not like we have the view or they have the view that if most people think a certain thing, or if most, non-philosophers endorse a particular view or speak a certain way, that then therefore it's true, like that's some simple inference. Rather, it's that this at least serves some role in setting the foundations for the plausibility of certain sorts of appeals to intuition, of certain sorts of appeals to what's supposedly intuitive or common sense. If someone says, I endorse phenomenal conservatism, if it seems true to me, then I'm justified in believing it in the absence of defeaters. Well, what if the philosophers that are reporting these particular sorts of seemings are like ultra idiosyncratic, and it's like, a couple hundred of them and nobody else has those seemings? That seems to me like that should be relevant to the sorts of arguments they're making if they're wildly out of accord with the way that non-philosophers think. Doesn't mean the view's wrong, but it seems to me that they would, if cornered on the matter, consider that relevant with respect to their own standards. So the what I often take to be a dismissive, ambivalent attitude towards this type of research, I just find it strange because it seems deeply relevant to many of the sort of, simply because they straightforwardly draw on claims about how non-philosophers speak or think.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll, as we move to talking about methodology in X-Fi, I have my issues with, once I ran my first study, I felt entitled to be like, my own research program, I can criticize it out of love now. So I have plenty of worries about the methodology in X-Fi. But the larger issue of just that research program at all seeming like such a threat or a waste of time, whichever one someone wants to bring up, I guess I'm really interested in, so not that it's X-Fi exists as a kind of debunking argument to other philosophical approaches, but it forces us to consider, are my philosophical intuitions coming out of a grad program at this college or that college, are they just very informed by a certain way of cutting up the world? And yes, the way my profs taught me and the things I was reading, you can cut up the world and there's a coherent picture placed there. But if let's take free will, I saw your discussion with Nova about this, and it gets framed as the real tension in free will, I think, to the philosopher that's going to teach this or learn about this, is often the determinism and whether it's compatible with free will, or determinism or whether it's compatible with responsibility. I actually saw a comment someone on your previous video had mentioned. They're like, wait, since when did we talk about compatibilism as determinism and responsibility? That's different than I was trained on. And that even has been a shift where right now, when you talk about free will and compatibilism, we're talking about moral responsibility, apparently. That's not always been the case, which points to what I'm saying, which is so much of this is the current trend of what people are reading or thinking about. But let's go with free will. It's framed as there's this thing called determinism. Does this pose a challenge for our favorite theories of free will or moral responsibility? Great. That is one interesting thing to focus on in that. It turns out, though, if you talk to people, and I actually ran a study, and I'm still in the transcribing process on those free will intuitions, some of those canonical thought experiments on free will using qualitative methods. But just in also my interpersonal conversations with people, they're often not so caught up on the tension just between determinism and free will. One of the things that shows up a lot is the epistemic feature. What do a lot of these thought experiments say, imagine a universe in which it's determined. They'll describe it without using that word, but so someone will go, yeah, wait, but would I know that within the universe? Because that's going to change how I view my actions. If I know that everything I've done is determined, that might change how I act. Or are you saying that as an outsider, I know that, but if I were the person in the universe, I wouldn't know that? Okay, that's a really interesting question. Philosophers have dealt with that throughout the centuries as well, but there's not as much literature in my reading that focuses on the role of the kind of epistemic condition that an agent is in within a universe. We're like, no, don't worry about that. Just imagine if it was determined and you knew that, what would that mean for your free will belief? And so I think some of what I'm interested in is like, we're not just checking if our theories mesh with what folks believe, but if what folks believe is like a different area of set of questions than we've been like narrowly focused on in the literature. And then maybe that's where some of this alienation comes between when you talk to someone that's, quote, a non-philosopher. I hate those words. They're philosophers. They just didn't go to the grad program you went to. But I think we should listen to the things that's on their mind. And a lot of times it's something like, it matters a lot if I know that determinism is true or not, because if it's always going to be a mystery to me, then I'm going to, and then they have one view as opposed to another. If they did have perfect knowledge, which they'll tell you they'll never have. So a part of it is just, if we don't listen to what the folks are getting at, I think we're going to just miss out on some interesting questions. That was way too long-winded. I'm sorry.
No, there's a lot of good stuff there. Yeah, I mean, so that I want to move into the qualitative stuff that was like sort of the central topic. But one comment on that is just, and I guess this is relevant to both of our work, is that when you ask those sorts of questions, a lot of the older work on free will, the participants, that epistemic considerations may or may not have occurred to any particular participant, that may or may not have influenced how that participant responded to the questionnaire or the paradigm that they were interacting with. And then you could get different participants responding differently based on, basically they're given underdeveloped information, inadequate context.
Yeah.
It's possibly ambiguous. It's possibly, when you pose a philosophical question to people, a thought experiment to people in a pedagogical context, often people don't, many times people just raise their hand or give an answer, but a lot of times they'll go, well, what do you mean by that? Or would this be the case? Like with the experience machine, people, a lot of times they'll go, well, would I ever see my friends or family again? Like they'll have questions. Well, if you're filling out a survey online or something, you can't ask any questions and you can't get any answers. And so if there's an ambiguity from your point of view, because, ambiguity, it's not like it's an intrinsic feature of the statement. It's that it all has to be interpreted. So if I say something and you're not sure if I mean A or B, you could not know how to respond, or you're going to have to pick A or pick B or something. What if you pick B and I meant A? Or what if you pick A and I meant B? So this type of underspecificity can influence how participants respond. And what troubles me about this is that can generate all sorts of variation in the responses that participants give. And it could even generate reliably recurring variation that gives the appearance of you finding psychological effects when really, like in accordance with what you're trying to measure, when what you're actually finding is when you ask underspecified, decontextualized questions, people resolve ambiguities in a variety of different ways, and you have no idea which ambiguity, how they're resolving them. So that, to me, that seems to me to apply to a lot of these free will cases, because the epistemic consideration, I think, is a big one, and it's actually analogous to some of the epistemic concerns in the meta-ethics stuff. Are you familiar with the Caesar soup cases?
Mm-hmm.
So this was a really fun one. So James Beebe, there's Caesar soup, Caesar's wine, depends on the case.
Okay.
So you have are you familiar with the disagreement paradigm, like the meta-ethics stuff?
Only because I'm a frequent watcher of Lance Independent.
Okay, so you may have seen this scenario. Okay, so
yes.
If you ask people about, like, two people disagreeing about murder, and you say, can they both be right or is one wrong? Right. People will give a particular answer. But what Beebe did is ask people, if two people disagree about whether Caesar drank wine on his 21st birthday, can they both be correct, or must at least one be incorrect? He actually had about 45% of people say they could both be correct. Now, does that mean 45% of people are historical relativists that think that historical facts are determined by your preferences? I don't think so. I think that there's an epistemic consideration going on there, where they're like, look, if I don't know the answer and neither of these people know the answer, this one could be right, that one could be right, but not necessarily they could both be right at the same time. And so I think when you ask unanswerable questions, it might pivot towards people interpreting the disagreement in epistemic in terms rather than some other type of terms. So the very same question might be interpreted as an epistemic question in one context and not as an epistemic question in another context, even if it has identical wording and you're just changing the content. And I think psychologists themselves can learn something from what philosophers have done with this work, because philosophers are often super attentive to ambiguity in ways that I think psychologists aren't. Psychologists think you could just swap out, not, of course, not all psychologists do, make this mistake, but they think if you swap out the content, but keep the structure of the question the same, then it's the same question. And that's not true, because this question is interpreted holistically. So I think that there's insights that psychologists can get from philosophers, from this kind of research.
No, that's great. There's also that internet joke that everything is either like a sandwich or soup. So these people might have just been honestly reporting that wine is soup. But yeah, in all seriousness, no, that is like right on. Like, yeah, the idea that this triggers like 4 different rants in me. I'll just pick the one that's most coming to the forebrain here. So I've studied the Milgram experiment out of like interest, horror, like historical intrigue. Like it's got everything. And like, I think what I like about that experiment is he's so clear to carve out a research paradigm that I think is still inherited by a lot of psychology. And then here's now where I'm going to start criticizing XY out of love, because I believe in it. We then inherited a lot of the like methodological baggage. Like, so there's this move where it's like, no, we're doing legitimate, good philosophical work because we're borrowing from cognitive scientists and psychology. It's like, well, right, but that kind of assumes that they've got their methodology perfect and there's not big problems there. I could refer you to a crisis or two to maybe disabuse someone of that notion. So in the Milgram experiment, he basically says, like, I am treating the study of obedience and authority much like a chemist would study like physical interactions. Like he says, like, if you can understand combustion in the match, then you really could understand it in the forest fire. The same thing, if I can study obedience, its essence, this like Platonic stuff of like an obedience scenario, then I can understand capital O obedience because it's the same thing. Well, but that assumes like this kind of scientific worldview, which is that human social folk psychological phenomena are analogous to particles and chemicals and how they interact. So I think we're inheriting this physics model of studying things at all, and then we're applying it to humans, and that you can see that logic. Oh, all I did is I changed a word. That's kind of like a chemistry type of thinking. Oh, if I change the amount of this chemical or that chemical, I'm just isolating variables. But I think the problem is, I don't think humans, we're intentional beings, we're moral agents, we're wrapped in culture. We have a rich psychology, like, that cannot be reduced out easily. I would say not at all, but at least give me easily to this kind of like independent variable, dependent variable. So to me, it's not a surprise that when you start creating XY studies, I'll actually bring this to XY now, that model after like dependent, independent variable, as if you could like isolate a moral judgment or a philosophical judgment on one of the grandest, richest, most complicated conversation that has affected humanity. And you're going to just like say, this axis on my graph represents this judgment agreement and this one represents that. I just think we have failed to see. I think we've treated humans more or less like particles in our the bottom floor of our methodology. So instead, I think we have to have a more interpretive methodology that allows for the messiness, context, cultural significance of human thought. And the best one I know about, seemed good enough for Socrates, was you have to have some kind of like open-ended conversation space. My joke on this, and then I'll kick it back to you. I'm curious. I said a lot there. It's like, imagine if Socrates came up to someone and was like, so I want to know, do you think this is an instance of courage? Don't explain yourself. Just give me a response on a Likert scale 1 to 7 in agreement that this is an instance of courage, and just leave it there. I don't want to hear any follow-up. Thank you, and I'll go take this. Obviously, this is not going to get to the rich back and forth critical dialogue that Socrates was getting at.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Yeah, I mean, that's what ended up being the direction of my whole line of research, was gradually and grudgingly discovering that a exclusive focus on quantitative methods and experimentation and treating it, constantly having it drummed into you over and over and over. These are the gold standard. These are the gold standard. That's what you should be shooting for. Yeah, those are the gold standard for a mature science with sufficient descriptive and observational resources to build a broad and rich theoretical foundation from which to make plausible hypotheses relevant to that particular theoretical foundation. If you have something like natural selection, or you've got a periodic table, or you've got a whole bunch of astronomical observations, you can start, it took a whole just outrageous amount of data from someone like Kepler, to start figuring out what was going on in our solar system. It wasn't just someone running an experiment. It was do observation for many, 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 many years. There's a paper by Paul Rosen. I think it's called something like Some Lessons from Solomon Asch. Have you seen? It's a fantastic paper. Yeah, and
it's like this paper. Like, why aren't you adhering to these? Like, we know this isn't working.
Right, and so you see this, and that paper. I think the paper is 2001, so it was written a long time ago, like right at the dawn of experimental philosophy, kind of the same year that the sort of main Weinberg-Nichols-Stitch paper was, since 2001. I think those are the same years. If I'm wrong about that, then too bad. Then I can't remember the dates of publications of papers off the top of my head all the time. But it's such a cool paper because it lays out this sort of historical analysis of how psychology seemed to jump the gun and get too far ahead of itself in leaping into experimentation and these quantitative approaches, which of course are fantastic and important, but they need to play a dynamic interaction with the qualitative and the observational and the descriptive work in order to have that sort of font to draw. And I see kind of one as like all the sort of raw material, and then the other as a method of refining that material. And it seems like psychologists just want to keep refining and refining and refining without gathering grain first. And it's understandable why. And it's because the institutions that were in place for sort of absorbing and lending status to and advancing careers in the STEM fields was predicated on, look, we've got enough of the observational stuff. Give us some experiments. Show us what you can do with this. Yeah. And psychologists I think the field got prematurely into that, which isn't to say that there isn't a time and place for experiments, but there seems to be a comparative, I don't know the right phrase, but it's considered, I don't know a good way to put it, maybe like less prestigious, less impressive from the point of view of psychologists to provide purely qualitative data or purely descriptive data, or to do observational research, even though I don't see how a field can possibly develop and advance and progress without that kind of data. And so I ended up doing that kind of data because I see all this quantitative research. I have these concerns about the research, and I didn't think there was a good way of getting at those questions using purely quantitative methods. I did actually end up using some quantitative methods, but those quantitative methods were actually developed off the basis of the qualitative methods. So, I said quite a few things there, but it's just to sort of
that's great.
Try to echo your sentiments back to you from my own perspective and experience.
Let me. I want to, for folks that let me concretize an example of the thing I think that we've talked about, which is just. So this is a response from I ran a Zoom study, which if folks are interested in using Zoom for like XFi and stuff, I thought it worked out quite well as opposed to in person. I ran a Zoom study on the canonical free will vignettes in the XFi literature, but I had folks think aloud as they were reading the vignettes, the thought experiments, so that if they had a question or a thought while reading it, I would capture that in audio. And then I had some follow-up interviews. And so to show what the kind of thing we're worried about, I think, and I think you can correct me if I'm wrong after this, let me read you one of the thought experiments and then the kind of response that makes me go, how can we do quantitative work if this is the kind of qualitative response we're getting? So here's, and again, these are just fun. I think that's half half of this is like, why do X, Y? It's super, who doesn't like, you write a little fiction and then you see what people think about it. Imagine there is a universe that is recreated over and over again, starting from the exact same initial conditions and with all the same laws of nature. In this universe, the same conditions and the same laws of nature produce the exact same outcomes, so that every single time the universe is recreated, everything must happen the exact same way. For instance, in this universe, a person named Jill decides to steal a necklace at a particular time. And every time the universe is recreated, Jill decides to steal the necklace at that time. And then the questions you were asked: when Jill steals the necklace, does she act with free will? And secondly, is Jill morally responsible for stealing the necklace? So this is from, I think, one of the studies that really kicked off the free will XY stuff, Namias et al. And I think it's great. Their work is fantastic. It got this kind of research program going around in XY about getting at whether people are more compatibilist or incompatibilist with respect to free will or moral responsibility. So let me first just get your, I mean, you've read this. What stands out to you in that scenario, this description? Like, what are the kind, as a philosopher, like what do you want to think about or talk about without answering the questions as if you're taking this?
Oh no, I was so focused on anticipating an answer, I wasn't thinking about it. Can you read it again?
Yeah. Imagine there is a universe that is recreated over and over again. Someone in the comments should like timestamp this concrete example. This is like, maybe this is the one moment where I'm like clear enough about what I'm getting at. Starting from the exact same initial conditions and with all the same laws of nature. In this universe, the same conditions and the same laws of nature produce the exact same outcomes, so that every single time the universe is recreated, everything must happen the exact same way. For instance, in this universe, a person named Jill decides to steal a necklace at a particular time. And every time the universe is recreated, Jill decides to steal the necklace at that time. When Jill steals the necklace, does she act with free will? And is Jill morally responsible for stealing the necklace? So yeah, just thoughts on that scenario, all that.
I've had some time to think about it. What I can say is when I hear thought experiments, instead of thinking, how would I answer the thought experiment? My brain immediately goes to identify possible points of confusion and ambiguity, identify, so I start thinking in these meta terms about how other people would think about it. So when I hear a scenario like that, like the universe is repeated over and over, one of the most common responses I get when I talk to people about this is people sort of rejecting the scenario. This is a really common reaction I have. I mean, a lot of times people just roll with it, but sometimes people go, I don't think that's possible, or how would that work? Or why would it be that way? So, and a lot of this isn't disengagement, it's actually engagement. People are enjoying this scenario, just they have more questions. So the first thing that I think when I hear a scenario like that is that it's highly unusual. It's very science fiction-y, and at least from the point of view of not like people that are engaged in the study, like people that are not studying philosophy. Like to me, maybe a deterministic scenario doesn't sound very science fiction-y, but when you start talking about like eternal recurrence and repeating the universe, it starts to sound out there. And a lot of people react to that in a variety of interesting ways. Some of them are not that interested in those scenarios. Some of them, they're like, well, why? Maybe that's not possible. How can I consider that? Or they'll think, why is it that way? Or they start imagining possible ways of, one of the things people do is something that like I always try in video games, which is to like break the game. Like if there's a building you're not supposed to go to, I want to get up behind it. And so people will do this. And it's the same thing with trolley problems. They'll be like, well, I just shouted to people and then that would get them out of the way. Okay, well then if there's a switch, then I'm going to break the switch off and I'm going to use that to block the train. Like people will start, trying to sort of game the system. They try to come up with solutions that are outside the strictures that you're trying to put on them. Interestingly, this is actually very much like what you were mentioning earlier about, trying to particleize the way that we think about human psychology, which is that real world judgments occur in rich actual contexts in which one's actions are not typically constrained to 2 or 3 or a very narrow range of choices. And so what we're trying to treat people's psychological, like their judgments in these scenarios as is we're trying to isolate the variables with the thought experiments and treat them like, it's like one chemical solution or another chemical solution. Yeah. And that's just not how actual real world rich contextualized judgment works. It occurs in these ecologically rich contexts in which one's options are typically very open-ended. And when you take people out of those ecologically rich scenarios, like I have in mind like the ecological validity of real world judgment, but when you take people out of those and constrain their judgments and say, no, you have to pick A or B, I think that the very act of doing that changes the psychology in a way that it's no longer representative of the way that actual psychology typically operates. And that itself is a sort of inherent limitation in any type of research like this, where you're giving people thought experiments and typically they're not asked open-ended questions, or typically asked multiple choice questions, or Likert scale questions, like how much do you agree or disagree with this statement about that scenario? So already I'm thinking that people are going to have some degree of resistance or questions or interest in engaging that they're unable to act on. And all of that is sort of sucking out the living nature of the thought experiment and turning it into, in a study context, this dry, dead, non-interactive thing that doesn't do the work that I think it does do in an actual sort of dialectical scenario.
100% agree. And so let's say someone hears that, and what I've been saying, we're saying like these kinds of questions, these surveys, these quantitative attempts to categorize someone's judgment, you're thinking of all these different ways that someone could unintentionally or intentionally break that in the way that they would respond to these scenarios. So that is at least one empirical question I think me and the quantitative folks can agree upon. If that is going on, we could see if that's going on. We could see if people really are having all these, like I call them messy and multifaceted or multifarious judgments. Okay, so that's what I've been doing in my research. And let me just give you just one response that to me just says, how could we do yes or no or Likert scale after this? And so just to remind folks, the vignette, the universe is created over and over. Jill steals the necklace at a particular time every time. And so the questions were about, does she act on her own free will, and is she morally responsible? So here's one participant. And it's messy speech because it's someone thinking in real time. But I like to keep that in there so that we can get a sense of like what a transcript looks like. So here's a response where I'm going to argue this person is taking on two different perspectives in thinking about Jill's necklace theft. The participant says, quote, I would say, yeah, it's not fair to hold her morally responsible because we know that her decisions are not, that they're all predetermined by the initial conditions. However, like inside the universe, let's say if they didn't know, then they might still, blame her and all that. But I don't think it's fair to hold her morally responsible. So speech is messy because that's how humans talk, but it's there. It says, like my vantage point, knowing that her decisions are all predetermined by the initial conditions of this recreated universe. I'm not debating whether that's a correct assessment of the vignette, but that's what this participant understood it as. From their perspective, they say, yeah, I guess Jill's not responsible. But people in the universe don't have this, third person omniscience. And again, to quote, they might still, blame her and all of that. So there's this like dual perspective taking in this person's response. I didn't ask them to take on multiple perspectives. And they go, well, I guess if you're asking about Jill's moral responsibility, it depends. Are you talking about the people within the universe or from my omniscient perspective, which, by the way, not a single human will ever be privy to? So there's a lot of interesting things going on. Now, what I like about this format in using qualitative methods is I can hear that response and follow up and go, good, let's take those one at a time. Can you say more about, you're saying, because Jill is not responsible, let's follow up that line of thought, and then let's imagine it is someone within the universe. But the bigger takeaway is, how could that response get graphed onto is Jill morally responsible, yes or no? what box does that fit in? It depends, it's messy, it's complicated. And that doesn't even get to the other layers, which is this participant doesn't say, and the people would inside the universe would be right or wrong to hold Jill morally responsible. The participant is saying they would still blame her. Okay, that in itself is a complicated issue. Is the idea that they're blaming Jill because they think they have the grand moral justification to do so, or that's just how you have to blame people that steal necklaces to keep society running. So like each of these gives way to like a whole world, like the whole world of philosophy, where you know that when you're talking about free will, you can't say, oh, I'm interested only in metaphysics and epistemology is not my thing. No, they're all in the same bin here. So the epistemology shows up, the metaphysics of agency shows up, the ethics shows up, the cultural norms show up, legal, like all of these things are there. And do I think a qualitative interview can capture all of that? Hell no. But it gives us a sense of how messy these judgments are, and should, I think, make it pretty clear that relying on a survey for, again, why do philosophers get the free will question? Because it's one of the hardest, perennial questions that will continue to grip our, like, the reason why this shows up in philosophy is that it's not a neat empirical question. So the idea that you're just going to take a survey, 40 cents a pop on Qualtrics or whatever, like, I don't know. This is where I'll be a bit more provocative. XFi surveys have an arrogance problem, and I think we need to be humbled by how interesting this folk response is, how complicated, how messy it is, and the idea that we're going to bring an apparatus of here's how you think about free will and determinism and compatibilism in this short paragraph. Yes, no, hit publish. It should have been one last flourish to be more provocative, and you can take up on these lines of inquiry if you'd like, or just leave them. The fact that we don't even know on Qualtrics, or what's one of my things, Amazon Mechanical Turk, if someone's engaging with, I know 100% of my participants engaged with the content. You know why? Because I was there. I interviewed them. I saw the responses. We're having a conversation. The fact that we in XFi can't even be sure if people are treating this like a DMV quiz where you're just trying to finish and get to the quiz at the bottom, and that we have to create a thing called an attention check in hopes that we might make sure they're paying attention. These are red flags. Or the fact that you could pay someone 40 cents for a moral judgment. These should have been red flags to say that there's a lot of conveniences that seem to be speaking to these methods, not good epistemic methodological reasons.
Yeah, I should say, well, I think that experimental philosophy often deals with especially tricky questions and paradigms and issues. A lot of this, I think, bleeds over into problems that were already present in research to begin with. And I think that they go largely ignored. So, a lot of people, I haven't talked about this a lot on my channel, but there's been this ongoing, it's called a crisis in psychology, the replication crisis, where a lot of studies are published that don't replicate, meaning if you attempt to redo the study in as close an approximation of the original way it was done as possible, you don't get the same results. You don't get, if it was statistically significant in a particular direction, you don't get, again, statistically significant results in the same direction. You get null results, might even go in the opposite direction. Now, all of that is, again, recapitulating this problem of this obsession with quantitative methods and statistics and mathematics. Now, when you say this, people go, oh, so you're saying it's not important. It's one of the most frustrating things in the world. If you say there's too much focus on this, is that people treat it as if to some extent, our focus is zero sum, but it's not always zero sum. There are ways of funding, hey, we should have more funding for this, and keep the funding where it is, and then also put some funding into that. It doesn't have to always be perfectly zero sum. So if I say that there's too much of a focus on that, I'm not saying it's unimportant. I'm saying there are other things that are also important. And one of the other things that's important is measurement. It's, psychology is measuring all these invisible variables, latent variables. It's hard to do. And to the extent that it's treating itself as being modeled on physics, fine. But then if that's the case, you're working with like the Higgs boson, you're not working with, you know, a rock where you could look right at it. A lot of the stuff that we're dealing with is very, very, very hard to pin down. And that strains the analogy too much, because it's not like it's hard to pin down because we need the right equipment, we need the time, we need the resources, we need the right models to sort of pinpoint to, you know, out to a million digits, not that many digits, but like there's a question of like physics has its specific ways that it's dealing with things. With psychological stuff, you're often dealing with it's a mess. Instead of it being, it's like finding a needle in a very, very, very large haystack, which might be what a kind of problem you're dealing with in physics, which comes with all of the particular challenges that's coming with. It's more like someone saying, here's a problem that's spread out. Like it's not a needle in a haystack, but like I fragment the needle into a million parts and spread them all over the place in a really weird pattern. Figure it out. That's a different ballgame. That's a whole different type of problem to deal with. And so psychology has, in a certain sense, equally challenging problems, but they're challenging for different reasons. And when psychology sort of just imports the STEM model into its methods and its assumptions, you just are immediately confronted with problems that it's difficult to circumvent because you're not taking the right approach. And, you know, I favor this more holistic approach to addressing these questions. So already the issues you raised, I think, move over into psychology. But one thing I wanted to mention about the free will stuff in particular, I did do a little bit of writing about this, although it's not anything that's made it into publication or into my dissertation. The original dissertation, I was thinking of working on metaethics and free will, but already metaethics got way out of hand with how big the scope was, so I dropped the free will stuff. But I have worked quite a bit outside of that on the free will stuff. Have you seen the free will scales, like the free will and determinism plus scale, the free will inventory, that sort of thing?
I feel yes, and like I guess my real deep skepticism is probably going to come forward here. Like I just like the idea that you would have a free will scale. This is, to me, this is the issue. And I don't know your view. You might actually love the scale, and I'm saying things and we should disagree, and that's great. But so the idea, you mentioned the replication crisis. I think the crisis we need to talk about, which was way more uncomfortable because it changes a lot of how we think about these things, is a validity crisis. Replication crisis is like a solvable one, right? Because it's like, you know, presumably if we replicate the conditions, we should get the same result. And if we don't, we can say that study had some issue or the instructions they get or whatever. Like that seems like a practical solvable thing. I think the real issue is we don't know, and I'm talking psychology, philosophy, both together. Like we often don't know if we're studying the thing we think we're studying, right? We just kind of assert oftentimes that we're like, oh, this is a measure of trust. This is a measure of obedience. But I want to even go to a deeper level, which is that I'm not sure that, I think this is the physics model coming through. I'm not sure there is like, you know, the construct, right? And that's the term that psychologists use, that there really is some like Platonic thing that we like. The validity assumes there really is some kind of thing, or at least the kind of like standard psychology textbook. There is something that we're trying to measure. I'm not even convinced of that, because I think that model is predicated on the natural sciences that are not the social sciences, that we, just as the chemists can study combustion or the interaction of these chemicals, that so too can we likewise study obedience, trust, moral judgment. So to say that there's a scale is already to I get off the bus there, because that assumes that there is a thing that the scale will scale on. And I think once we're dealing with humans that have intentionality and are bound up in folk psychological understandings of the world and beliefs and desires, like it might be useful on occasions to talk about obedience as a general concept, but I don't think that commits me to there is a conceptual analysis of obedience that can give me necessary and sufficient conditions, and I can study it like a scientific object. And so scales for me, yeah, tell me what you think about that.
Yeah. So basically what I argue is, I have a paper. It's a short version of a much longer paper that I did for a qualifying exam. And what ended up happening is I looked at the compatibilist, incompatibilist literature, and I wrote a bit about that. But then I shifted my focus to the scales. My problem with the scales is that the main papers that end up devising these measures for free will, I started having the same worries I had about metaethics, but in this case, it was much more egregious. And one of my initial thoughts was, well, hold on. The central dispute about free will in the academic literature is what free will is. How do we characterize it? So you have, a libertarian conception of what free will is very different from a compatibilist conception of what free will is. And if I were measuring belief in libertarian free will, I wouldn't ask the same kinds of questions as I would ask if I were measuring belief in a compatibilist conception of free will. And so if you're trying to measure belief in free will in a way that did not disambiguate the two, what would the questions look like? Like, I don't even know what they would look like in principle, because what matters when responding to a question like, do we have free will, is, well, what do you mean by free will? Let's say I'm a compatibilist and you say, do you think we have free will? And you only endorse a libertarian conception of free will. And I don't know that. And I say, yes, you might think that I endorse libertarian free will, but I don't. So you would have to ask the question appropriately. There's either a context in which the philosophical presuppositions behind the claim, or that there's a sort of theoretically neutral way of framing it where you're like, yeah, I believe in free will because I reject the no free will positions and I fall within the category of either libertarian free will or compatibilist free will. But to have a view like that requires a dialectical framing that ordinary people, like, people without substantive philosophical training, they're not part of that. They don't have the context to give that kind of answer. And so, you get items on these scales like, I have free will, agree, disagree. What the hell does that mean? Like, if one person says they have free will and another says they have free will, do they think the same thing as each other? I don't know. You would have to operationalize it first, and you didn't do that. So really what you're measuring is whether they assent to a technical term. Is this supposed to be an ordinary term? How would they know what the technical term's meaning is? So you get all these problems. So what I end up arguing, which is, it's interesting because you said this having not known what I end up arguing, is I say basically, it's unclear that there is any particular construct of free will to be measuring in the first place. Given that, it doesn't seem sensible to devise measures where it's not clear. Like, you would need to have a clear sense of what you're operationalizing in order to devise an appropriate measure for it. The papers that have these scales didn't do that. They just have free will measures. It's not clear what they could be measuring, like, at all. Like, I don't know what they're measuring. But then, setting aside all of those concerns, which I think are decisive in the first place, like, what is the construct you're measuring? If you can't tell me, how could you have possibly devised appropriate measures for measuring? In principle, like, how could you do it? Like, what? I guess in principle, you could be very, very lucky. But I guess I should say, in practice, why should I believe you're doing that? So then you actually look at the items on the scale, on these scales, and I have immediately huge problems with them. Some of them emphasize moral responsibility. So it's stuff like people are always responsible for what they do. If a person agrees with that, that means they believe in free will. Why? Like, that only means they believe in free will if they share with you the conception that one is only responsible if they have free will, and if they're not responsible if they don't have free will. And immediately there's problems with that. In order for that to be an appropriate characterization of a belief in free will, they would have to understand free will. They'd have to understand like a desert-based conception of free will. I keep mixing up terminology. They would have to have a desert-based conception of moral responsibility, not a conception of responsibility that's actually consistent with incompatibilists, like no free will accounts, like Dirk's account, or Dirk Perboom. Even if you don't believe in free will, you could say people are responsible, but they're responsible in respects other than the respect that is picked out by the desert-based conceptions of technical for a respondent in one of these surveys to have any clue that that's what you're trying to disambiguate. So responsibility questions, not necessarily appropriate. Another problem, one of the items on here on the FAD Plus, I don't know if you've seen this item. It is this: strength of mind can always overcome the body's desires. What? So if I agree with that, that means I believe in free will. Why does that mean I believe in free will?
That's the Kantian scale.
Yeah, I don't know what that's asking. It seems like it's asking some sort of like proto-scientific view about like willpower. like, and the
Right.
ability of like the rational impulses to suppress bodily, like it's a very strange question to be asking people. That's like presumptively, it's like embedded in a presumptive notion of a sort of unscientific folk psychology. It's a weird question, and I don't know what
Okay,
it means.
so I'm glad you have the right view. No, I'm glad we agree on the scale skepticism. To keep pushing on that, like, well, first I just drew up one more participant response because it's just like it's so subtle how something could change. One different understanding of a term could change everything. So here's me in an interview. Excellent. You indicated that it would be fair to hold Jill morally responsible for her decisions in this universe. What do you mean by morally responsible, or how are you interpreting that in this context? For me, that seems like a wild question to ask. What do you mean by this? But we don't do that enough. Participant, I guess more in like a judicial or like criminal sense. So here we are. Here's the philosopher. Like, of course, I'm talking about deep, robust, ontological level grounding of moral truths, and they're thinking about equally good. Like I'm not. That's great. Judicial, criminal, right? Why isn't that the main or first lens that someone takes? Of course, the philosopher writing that did not have that in mind. In fact, they used the word morally responsible so as to avoid any confusion with something quote more social. But that just shows that like we are baking our dispositions or views or prejudices into these thought experiments. I mean, just look at all of them. They have this grand backdrop of a sciencey universe. We love this, right? It's so like post-enlightenment, post-scientific revolution. Philosophy has physics MB. It's this big grand universe, and there's a single acting individual committing a single act. Like that's what we think of free will as. Well, I think in most people, not most people. I think in many people's cultures or experiences, like they're not thinking of morality and responsibility as like there's individual agents carrying out actions against the backdrop of this like weird and mysterious laws of nature. It's like, oh, someone did something at work, and I wear this hat as a family person, and I'm in this context, I'm a lifeguard, and so I have these different responsibilities. Like, I don't think they view morality as how philosophers do in this canonical 20th century analytic approach, where you have agents and their actions, which, virtue ethics is very appealing to a lot of people because it at least starts to push away from the idea that we're going to kind of like formalize what it means to carry out moral or immoral action. But again, these thought experiments, they bring that. We love it. The trolley experiment, there's this world going on, and it's up to a single, I mean, it's so American. It's so Anglophone, right? It's like there's a single actor, and they're going to do or not do. And did they, I think this is where I like the work of Carol Gilligan, who is, I think, someone like I view as in the larger history of XFi, interviewing women about how they think through the decision whether or not to get an abortion. And you get the kind of messiness of life, and they're like, well, my church thinks this, but I'm also feeling this obligation to my partner, and also, financially. Like, that's how people think through these decisions and will and responsibility. But no, we try to reduce that all away. And there's a time and a place for that. I'm not saying we don't run trolley thought experiments and quantitative surveys ever, but if that is the dominant 99% of what we're getting, then we're never going to be able, it doesn't give room for pushback that these might not be the best and only ways to tackle these issues.
Yeah, it's great stuff. I think we got to get to the implies can stuff before it gets we get too far into the weeds. I just want to dovetail on that with just one point that you raised about the kinds of questions we ask. That there's something very Western about the questions.
Yes.
I bring up in a lot of psychological research, the problem with it. One of the big problems, in addition to validity, measurement, replication, all of these other problems, is generalizability. And I'm raising it because other people have pointed out that the vast majority of psychological research has been conducted on participants from weird populations. So, this acronym, it's people that that are from populations that are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Something I always emphasize: What this means is that the participants in these studies tend to be from these populations, like the nations that tend to exhibit these traits. It doesn't mean anything about like every single person in that society exhibits all of the traits. It just means that like on average that the participants in these studies are going to come from cultures and places that exhibit demographic differences relative to the rest of the world. And then, of course, like weird populations, it's not like it's a dichotomy, like it's either weird or not weird. Cultures are complicated and cultures vary in the degree to which they exhibit these particular traits. Anyway, it's not just the participants in the studies, it's the people conducting the research. They come from these backgrounds. And in fact, I think in one of the studies, in that original paper from Henrik Heine and Noren Zion, they said something like 97% of research is conducted by researchers from or within weird places, something like that. It was some huge number. Don't quote me on that percentage, but It's larger than the number of participants themselves. And so if the researchers themselves are coming at these questions with all of the sort of distinctive cultural, like they're coming at it with a very narrow cultural lens, then the questions they ask, the way they interpret the data, all of that is going to be influenced by their own perspectives entirely apart from the participants in the studies. And, this is one problem with trying to just say, okay, well, just get these researchers to go conduct research in another population. Okay, then, but they're still going to bring their own biases to bear in what questions they ask, how they ask the questions, and how they interpret the results. What you're going to need is to have researchers who are themselves from a variety of different cultural backgrounds to construct this research. The problem is, okay, so let's say you wanted to get researchers with all these different cultural backgrounds. Okay, but if you're going to have them, if they are they publishing papers in philosophy journals in English in the United States? Because what are you going to do? Bring them into a department where you hit them with Kant for 15 years? And then you're just inducting them into the same biases that are influencing philosophers. So I have a serious problem with the way that the researchers are doing this research, which is that, it's one thing for the researchers to come from weird populations, but philosophers don't just happen to be from a Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic population. Western is one component of that, but it's a very big component. And the sort of the most weird populations of all are like the United States, the UK. Where is most analytic philosophy just is a philosophical discipline that emerged in this, like it's just pretty much like it's ultra weird, I guess you could say. And so you have people that spend years and years and years, not just within the if you had like a spectrum of like most weird to least weird, they're in the most weird places in the world. They're then inducted into exclusively reading this canon of the very thinkers that form the foundation of Western thought in the first place. It's like they're getting like a super magnified, intensified like exposure to weird thinking. And then those people are going to conduct this research. So you're just going to get people to just basically, steep themselves in biases for 20 years before they start running the research. And then the problem is that the people that aren't even doing the research, they, like the sort of armchair philosophical thinking where they're like, most people think this way. These are people that have had such intense training in a very narrow worldview and they think they're in a position to make judgments about how everybody everywhere thinks. It just strikes me as so like I don't have a nice one. It's like ludicrous. Like, shouldn't they know better? Shouldn't they know that but philosophers will say, well, in virtue of my competence in speaking the English language, I can make judgments about how everyone everywhere through all time thinks about everything. There's over 6,000 languages in the world. There's countless cultures. They think that they could just transcend all of that with a priori reasoning. And it boggles my mind that they think they could do that. But we need to be careful not to think that, well, as soon as we, put on our psychology hat and start running studies, that we've escaped that. I don't think we have. We carry our cultural legacy with us wherever we go. And even conscious effort to minimize its influence, I don't even think that goes far enough. So I don't know what to do about that. That seems like an insurmountable problem to me.
I'll take you up on that. What to do? Move to the on-place can. I think it all. I have my view, and that's kind of where I am on a lot of this, which is a lot of this stuff that I'm criticizing in X-Fire psychology would be, I think, a lot less obnoxious if it was just like owned. If it was like, yeah, these are the thought experiments that come out of this specific tradition. So I'm not getting at capital FW free will. I'm getting at, I'm starting a conversation with non-trained philosophers or just folks about historically, 20th century analytic thought experiments, and I'm interested in interpreting what comes of that. And I'm gonna engage with them. I'm not studying them as objects like scientific objects. I'm participating in a dialogue with my participants, and from that, there's gonna be some fruits of that, and I'm gonna try to argue that it points to some interesting things. But I'm not, quote, finding things. I'm not, quote, discovering things. I'm not I don't think, maybe my memory is bad, but I don't think ever as an undergrad in psychology, I heard anything but, we found in the study or we discovered. It wasn't like, hey, we're arguing on behalf of this data that X. And I think there's a lot of reasons, right? It's that physics bias that we want to view ourselves as objective. But I think the reverse should be the new way forward for XY is to own that I'm interpreting a thought experiment. Sorry, I'm interpreting data from a thought experiment, and that thought experiment itself includes some of my interpretations on how we might meaningfully talk about free will. And it's interpretation all the way down, but I'm going to stand on it at the end of the day, and you can take it or leave it. You can find my kind of ethnographic exploration of this issue with the rich data output. You can find it compelling or not. And I'm not going to make attempts to try to make it seem more scientific. So going to the implies can thing before we hit the Joe Rogan amount of podcast time. This is look, if you read the paper, I know how to put on the I'm not going to color outside the lines, especially if my research involved qualitative methods, which I think immediately people are going to be suspicious of. So I know I had in that paper, I'm as close to the data as possible that I try to not make any large claims without having numbers because people like numbers. But I do want to as we talk about it, expand on, I think, these larger issues about a way forward. So implies can, roughly, often attributed to Kant. Other folks thought of it, talked about it prior, after, but it's very Kantian in nature. And it just says that for you to be morally obligated to do something, it also is the case that you can do that thing. So if you were morally obligated to donate $5 to charity, it's also the case that you can do that. So the way that experimental philosophers have been interested in this is, well, is that relationship as tight as Kant seems to think it is? Is it really the case that if you can't carry out some action, that it no longer obtains that you're morally obligated to do it? Or is this just some kind of particularity of Kant's thinking that grounds his ethics? So one way we might see that is, let's give folks scenarios where an agent can't carry out some action that they had kind of previously agreed to carry out. They made a promise to someone. And then once we have them unable to do it, we'll ask participants, are they morally obligated to do so? I should actually just get out the scenarios themselves, because that's probably better. So my basic approach was to look at a study by Chiduk, Henny, Synod Armstrong, and Dave Regard. And theirs in the literature, I think, was really foundational. It was an excellent paper. And they ran a number of thought experiments, but the ones I focused on, there was a high fault version and a low fault version. So let's give this a read. This is based on Synod Armstrong's work, I think in the early 80s, on the connection between on implies can. Brown is excited about a new movie that is playing at the cinema across town. He hasn't had a chance to see it, but the latest showing is at 6 o'clock that evening. Brown's friend, Adams, asks Brown to see the movie with him, and Brown promises to meet Adams there. So the moral obligation is formed because there's a promise being made to go see this movie. Great. Then we have the high and low fault versions. The low fault version, basically, I won't go into the specifics, but Brown's getting ready to go. He decides to take his car, but the car breaks down. And so he can't make it to the movie by 6. And this theater has a really strict policy of not letting people in after the deadline. So he misses the movie because his car broke down. Now, there's some strange things in it, like it's a 15-minute drive and he leaves literally with not even a millisecond more than 15 minutes. So like it's got all the like details of a philosopher-made thought experiment, like what kind of movie theater doesn't let some, anyways. And people react to those things, by the way. So low fault, the car breaks down. High fault, Brown decides, I don't really want to go. So I'm going to wait an extra 5 minutes so that I can't make it there on time. So in both cases, there was a promise made, a moral obligation. Nothing's more Kantian than a promise. You got a moral obligation, right? And then an inability to make the promise, one because of this low fault car breaking down, and the other in this high fault, he just waits around, right? And then participants were asked 3 questions that are supposed to mirror the kind of like key facets of what's going on. One, could Brown make it, right? Just make sure they're kind of like grokking the scenario. It says very clearly he can't make it at 5:50. The second question, is he to blame, to make sure they're tracking the low fault, high fault kind of scenario. And then the third key question, Brown ought to make it to the theater by 6. So I said I wanted to kind of connect this study that I did with this larger, like what I see as good ways forward for X5. What they did is they took, scaled responses on these questions and analyzed it and found that people would give a no to Brown can make it, so he can't. And then they'd also say that he still ought to. So in those 2 quantitative responses, it looked like they were saying he can't, but he ought. And so that looks like a violation of ought implies can, which a separate conversation grounds a lot of a certain kind of like obligation, duty-based sense of morality. It kind of circumscribes what we are to be held responsible for, right? Those things that we ought to do must circumscribe, those things that we can do circumscribes what we ought to do. So they have that. But I think as a lot of folks that read this thought, well, are they saying that at any given moment in time, are they saying at this moment in time, 5:50, when Brown cannot make the meeting, that it's also true that he ought? Or were they kind of treating the questions differently as like, in this moment at 5:50, can Brown make it? No. And then this question over here, ought Brown make it? And they're just going, yeah, like generally one ought to keep their promises. So if that's what they're doing, then this is not relevant to ought implies can, because if they're treating it as like generally one should keep their promises, that is not standing in tension with the ought implies can principle. What it would take to be a violation of ought implies can is that someone says it's 5:55, he's 15 minutes away, he cannot make it, and at that very moment he also ought to make it. We need those happening at the same moment in time. That doesn't come through in the quantitative questions. In fact, the question about his ability to make it, can he make it, has a timestamp on it. The one about his obligation doesn't. So it's not even in the questions that we're talking about the same place and same time. So what I did is I gave people these same surveys, but I asked them to think aloud as they navigated them. And then I interviewed them afterwards. Now, the beauty of the think aloud method is I have yet to say a word to them. So they're just reacting. And so if they bring up any issues with these questions or the vignette, it's their doing. It's not like you can't accuse my questions of having like introduced what I think might be the result. And you'd get things like this, where they'd get to the question about Brown ought to make it to the theater. And it started to become clear that he should have made it to the theater. He should have, past tense, when he was able to, made it to the theater. And they would use the language of should have, rather than he should. Okay, then I'd ask them about that in the interview. And long story short, we find out that, like, yes, they thought Brown had the obligation, but they were reluctant to say he still had the obligation once the inability kicked in. So that's exactly what we'd expect if someone was upholding ought implies can. The original study claimed that these people's responses showed that people violated ought implies can. In these rich, reiterative interviews and think aloud sessions, I kept finding the same thing over and over and over again. Whenever it looked like someone is violating ought implies can, it's because they were just saying something general about, like, we should upkeep our obligations. And when I asked them about concrete moments, they would always revert to upholding ought implies can and be like, well, so I'd ask them at 5:55, ought Brown make it? And I go, no. So they would relinquish him of his obligation, but they'd want to say a bunch of other things like, well, maybe he's not obligated to make the promise anymore, but he should do the next best thing, or he should call him, or like all these other things that, like, normal people would say in this scenario. They wouldn't just go like, oh, he waited around 5 minutes for this draconian theater to not let him in, and like that's the end of the story. Like, no, go into action, Brown. Get on your phone, text Adams. But I argue that overwhelmingly people upheld ought implies can, and it was pretty clear when you saw their think aloud responses where they weren't interpreting the ought question the way the researchers had. And so here's my conclusion, and then I want your reaction and any questions. And what I'm imagining then is this is leading to a different kind of approach where it's more like a Geertzian reiterative, like through multiple questions, interview questions, and asking from different angles on the same idea. I'm not getting like the construct of their ought implies can view, but I'm starting to get, like, I'm swimming in the water with them and starting to get a general sense of how they're understanding obligation and its relation to ability. And by the end of that, I can make an argument that's like, look, if you read through these transcripts the way I did, and I'll tell you how I did, here's all 200 pages of them, single space. I think you're going to come out going, yeah, it looks like people did kind of uphold this in this kind of scenario. And so what I want to see XFI doing is, rather than trying to like formalize and say this principle is or isn't violated, get a sense of like the rich ways that people talk about it. But I think what it takes is the excessive work of having these conversations, recording them, transcribing them, and interpreting them. Okay, that's my pitch. Did I get the job?
Yeah, that was really cool. Yeah, so I didn't do something quite as rich as what you did. I asked people in a survey context just open-ended questions, and then they typed their answers in. So I did something kind of between the sort of conventional quantitative approach and the much more like rich and open-ended response. I do have a colleague that did do interviews with people on meta-ethics, and I did read those through those, and I've even presented some of that work. And so those are really interesting. And one of the differences between the two cases, and I'm curious about some of my concerns about this research and how that might relate to yours. I get the sense from reading those that people don't seem to have a consistent, well-developed, well-developed, like sort of coherent meta-ethical position that applies to like the moral domain as a whole. And this is, there's already been commentary in the literature on this, some of it sort of coming before the empirical literature. So you have Don Loeb's Moral Incoherentism, where Loeb argues that maybe people have simultaneously conflicting and like sort of mutually compatible meta-ethical commitments. And so their moral views or their meta-ethical views are in a certain sense incoherent. You have Ross Colebrook argues that maybe people are just irrational about meta-ethics, and that look at the data and you say, look, why is the person a relativist and a realist? And then they're kind of both, but kind of like, and this comes out of the quantitative data and it comes out of the qualitative data. And, what the view I ended up forming on that is that when I started looking at the qualitative data, the open-ended responses, what I found isn't that, the researchers said, most people gave these realist responses, but actually when I look at the answers, it looks like they're anti-realist or vice versa. Instead, what I got the impression of is regardless of whether they expressed or endorsed or seemed to express or endorse a realist or an anti-realist view, when they explain why they gave that answer, when they explain what they thought a question that's been used to measure their meta-ethical views is asking them, I asked a variety of other sorts of questions to get at how they're interpreting the questions. They didn't appear to interpret them in line with the researcher intent like at all. They seem to be interpreting them in terms of epistemic questions or normative questions or descriptive questions, like a variety of other different interpretations. Now, the first thing that I really try to bend over backwards to emphasize is that I don't think that this is because like the participants are not competent at philosophy or anything like that. Right. What I think is that if you ask people underspecified, ambiguous, impoverished questions that lack context in a survey setting, people have to fill in the blank, and they're going to do it in a variety of ways that I think are really sensitive to the types of rich concerns that would typically be present in the real world. So if you don't give people context, they will impute the context onto what you're asking them. So I actually think that the variation you get is a sign of how people really do think. And you're basically like trying to tie their hands and say, think without thinking the way you normally think. It's not going to work. So I go to pains to call these unintended interpretations, not misinterpretations. I don't like that language because it implies they made an error, and I don't think they're making errors. I think these, and I think it sounds very much the same way when you're asking people to think through their process. It's not a So, but I'm getting to where I'm going with this, which is that the takeaway I had from that is that I don't really think people have views about meta-ethics typically in most situations for most people most of the time. But it sounds like in your scenario, it looks like people were sort of leaning on the ought implies can principle. Now, do you think that people generally do sort of endorse, even if implicitly, some type of ought implies can principle, or would it be more indeterminate and it's something that sort of maybe they stumble on this principle in the process of the exchange?
Yeah, I tend to think, so this is maybe some of my frustration with just like analytic philosophy in general is like, actually, no, this is more of an expect thing, which is like ought implies can serves a role in a larger systematized ethics, right? Like it's kind of like finding out that there's a vitamin in a vegetable and then just kind of reducing it out and synthesizing that vitamin. It's like what Khan is doing, like ought implies can is a big part of, but it's like part of his system. Like I or whoever's using it. I mean, other people use it, but like for Khan, it makes sense given how he's thinking of oughts and obligations and abilities, right? And so it's like he's presenting you with a coherent, whether one agrees with it or not, like moral framework, and it's playing a role in there. It's like a girder, whatever it is, I don't know, for building, yeah, right. And so like the idea that you like grab that and bring it out and then just like study it individually. So I don't know that folks have this view or this principle, but when they're kind of when they're asked and probed to engage with something that is very Kantian, its framing, promises and broken promises, and like that's where everyone goes to that example first because it's the easiest to talk about what Kant's up to, I think. Then I feel like they find that as like a natural piece of ground to walk on, and they have a hard time. I'd say they have a hard time violating it, right? I don't think they have a principle or believe in ought implies can, but it's like once I've asked them about promise and promise breaking and obligations and duties, I would say many people find it intuitive to say, well, if you can't do it, then you're not obligated to do that very specific thing in that moment. But what they want to do, and I think this is more interesting, that's the least important part of their like worldview about this. They don't just want to go, no obligation anymore. They want to say all the other things. They want to say, yeah, Brown no longer has that obligation when he waits around too long, but he's a jerk. He should call him. He should still try to make it. He should signal his care as a friend, right? Like it's the difference of like, like, oh my God, I see your plane taking off. There's no way we're going to get you there on time. I don't know why I have the phone like that, but like I can no longer get there. And so you just stop dead in your tracks and you try no other thing to get your friend on the next plane. Like that as a friend, that would hurt my feelings if they're like, well, it's over, too late, and that was my obligation, see you later. You'd say, no, like, let's go inside and see if there's another plane taking off this afternoon. And that's what the participants want to talk about. In that whole panoply of like cutting up these scenarios, though, yes, I do think it's a firm rail that many people put their hands on. But I bet you could find scenarios, trick people into like violating on-place can. I just don't think that's very interesting. And in fact, I think these scenarios kind of are that. Like, obviously, when someone says you can't do it, you can't hold them responsible, they don't mean like, oh, why don't I just throw my keys in the gutter? I used this example once. Why don't I just throw my keys in the gutter? I'm no longer obligated to drive you to the airport. Like, that's obviously not what people mean by that. And so the idea that we're trying to like catch people in a bind here so that they say someone ought and can't. I don't think people have these principles, but there are firm rails that they stabilize themselves on. But if, let's say, I asked them without using duty and obligation and ability, and I didn't bring like a Kantian kind of framework behind this or a deontological framework, I don't think I'd see that principle show up at all.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's one of the things that some people have pointed out about psychological research is there's this problem, this like stimulus problem, where in moral psychological research we will take a very narrow set of moral scenarios and use those as representative of moral judgment as a whole, as if the particular scenarios that we use are representative of the entirety of moral judgment. One would almost get the impression, as much as I love like the trolley problem research, that the entirety of moral judgment centers on and can be understood exclusively in terms of whether you're willing to kill people to save people. Yeah. As like I've never done that. I think most people have never done that. That is very far removed from the actual types of in most contexts most of the time. So it's a really weird scenario. It's if you were trying to understand, I don't know, like cooking, and then you said, well, what would you cook if I gave you like 3 super bizarre ingredients, and then whatever the person says, you're like, yep, that's what people cook. No, it's not what people cook. Why are you giving them that scenario? So philosophers, I understand why they devised scenarios like the trolley problem, because they're crafted. I mean, part of the reason is just because they're fun. So I do think that actually is a motivation for some thought experiments. They're fun. Like people have fun with them. The other reason, though, is that the whole point is to try to craft scenarios where it's like they're good for isolating considerations that distinguish differences between positions that philosophers care about. And so to the extent that they emerged in the philosophical literature, they emerged to address and solve philosophical problems. Why would we think that automatically that makes them suitable, not just as tools of psychological measurement, but as like, that's all we need? It's very weird. So one thing to point out about a lot of it, like if you change the scenario, you don't frame it in terms of duties, people might give a different response. Okay, so if the literature, instead of it focusing on Kant, had focused on somebody else, like, I don't know, Mill or Bentham or something, then we could get this very different picture of how people think about, oughts and cans and that sort of thing. And so we're not triangulating on trying to address questions from a variety of angles. It's just whatever paradigm we happen to import over from philosophy. I think we tend to over extrapolate from that and then imagine that the principles that govern philosophical reasoning and the categories and distinctions there are reflected in, you could say, the sort of folk psychology in some nascent form, and we're sort of extracting that. And I don't know that people are like they either have a principle or not. It could be that it's a lot more sensitive to context, and like something principle like would emerge in some social contexts and not others. And so the question of do they have the principle, yes or no, it's like a misunderstanding of the way human psychology works. It's like not understanding that things are more like get this when you need it. It's more improvisational, the way that people reason and think and interact. And it's not like okay, when it comes to everyday moral judgment, what I don't think is that there's this like computationally representable structure that conforms to either consequentialism or deontology. And then whenever a person, like they have some system for recognizing when a moral judgment is engaged, and then they go to their consequentialism center or the deontology center, and then they crunch the numbers in accordance with the deontology or whatever. What is the moral duty? Execute moral duty. As if people are like these straightforward normative theory algorithm machines. Why would moral judgment be that way? Or maybe a combination of the both. It's a process model. I like at best that seems like an extraordinarily crude approximation of what's really going on, and I think it probably misses out on a lot. Sorry, I'm saying way too much there, but
no. We should put a wrap, because we could go back and forth. I think this means we should have another conversation before too long. But I'm conscious of, again, you just don't want to hit that Joe Rogan amount of timing. But yeah, maybe, do you have more ideas, follow-up questions? Otherwise, I would love to hear kind of your grokking of this conversation, and then mine, and then we could call it a day.
I feel like there might be too many questions about the ought implies can stuff. I guess the main question for me is, because some of them I think are too narrow and specific. I think the main question for me, given the context of this conversation, is the takeaways from that research project in terms of where you. Okay, so I guess the question would be, given those findings, given what you found with that project, what do you think the implications for experimental philosophy are going forward? How can we change what we do to do it better?
Awesome. Yeah, I do. I think that's good to leave on a positive note. And yeah, I think qualitative methods aren't going to solve everything. That's not my argument. But giving someone the conversational space to engage with ideas that, when we reflect on them, we take that conversational space to think through. We don't think in agreements to Likert scales. We have these internal dialogues, and Socrates is out there going back and forth to get at the root of things. I think that is essential. And I don't think that we can put this off. I'm not saying that this study resolved anything ought implies can. This is the most provocative thing I'll say about my own work here. If I had read my participants' transcript results from the Think Aloud and the interview, if I read that, and or if someone reads that, I think they should come away going, I don't think we can take seriously the findings from the quantitative surveys alone. I just don't. I think there's so much someone contradicting their own quote quantitative responses in there that, so I don't want to be more pessimistic. This moves to something positive, but I remember Noah was saying something like, no, that's good. Because you're saying how the meta-ethics stuff gets complicated when you've done these studies. And he's like, no, that's good. I do think it's good, but I don't think we can necessarily salvage a lot of survey-based X5 stuff. I really it's not that we found something and now we need to I'm not sure these ought implies can studies were finding things related to ought implies can. That's the most provocative thing I'll say. But what we can do, the positive view, is go out there, conduct the interviews, get your hands dirty with the data, and argue and interpret. Quit trying to look behind coding schemas and statistical significance. This is an interpretive humanistic discipline at the end of the day. And if you think that you formalized a judgment or anything else, it just means you've smuggled your interpretation into the vignette, into the questions, or into the statistical process that you're going to count as significant. So the good news is I think we have a way forward, which is to actually kind of be more philosophically traditional, which is engage in dialogue, reiterative, ask questions from all angles. We should do this to the Nova effect. We should do this with the harm help case in the chairman of the board. What happens when you have a rich interview question? I mean, it might be that right away people are like, well, I said intentional, but what I meant was this. Why would we not want that data? And then XFi can move away from making the same mistakes that I see is so prominent in psychology. It can avoid its own replication and validity crises. We should learn from their mistakes, and hopefully they learn from ours.
Okay, fair enough. I do want to be mindful of time as well. So I think there's so many ways to follow up on that. But yeah, I guess I would just say I think that what I would say about that is in some cases, I do think that some of the qualitative research can end up informing efforts to devise and refine quantitative questionnaires. And I don't necessarily think that like where it's got to be exclusively qualitative going forward. It could be that eventually with enough qualitative research, we can get a good handle on how to frame questions to people. Or it could be that those questions could be incorporated into a more iterative process at some point. So at the end of a conversation, it might make sense to ask someone some quantitative questions rather than at the outset. There are some, I would say, like quasi efforts to do this in the meta ethics stuff. You have the Pulsar and Wright paper, Anti-Realist Pluralism, where they basically were like, look, a lot of the previous research, people did not appear to interpret the distinctions in line with researcher intent. That's not their framing. That's my framing of it. But so they had people go through a process of showing them like, here's the distinction between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. And they used their identification of methodological concerns of previous research to enrich the response options in their questions. Like, so for instance, Beebe, who I mentioned earlier, included a non-cognitivist option in the disagreement paradigm and then found that that was often a very common or one of the most common responses. Taylor Davis actually found it was the most common response across a variety of measures. So the early studies didn't include that as an option. Maybe the researchers thought it's so implausible that people would be non-cognitivists that it's not worth including. But it turns out maybe that's not the case. Of course, there's methodological problems with that because there might be reasons why they would choose an answer like where they don't have to say people are right or wrong because that's a socially appropriate hedge. I don't have to say someone that disagrees with me is wrong. And I don't have to say I'm right because I could sound like a jerk. And so, social desirability concerns could favor choosing that response for reasons unrelated. But so you see, the problem is that like, does that mean we can't ask questions about this? No, it means that there's a lot of brush fires to put out, and doing psychological research is difficult. And the quantitative methods, look, what I'd say is this. I think that quantitative methods at the very least can be deeply informed by the qualitative approaches, that they can be used to mutually refine one another, that the research itself is an iterative process. It's a drawn out process of triangulation on the questions we're asking through a variety of different methods. And that I think any presumption that we could easily answer these questions with straightforward surveys from the outset, that I think was conceived, and that we need to overcome that and recognize that the problems we face are challenging. At least that's my take on this.
Let me say I really agree, and actually it makes me want to nuance one thing. I think a lot of what I'm reacting to is the oxygen taken up and the assurance ascribed to quantitative methods. If quantitative methods got put in their place, because all methods should be put in their place, then I think, and it was viewed as one tool of many to get at these interesting philosophical questions, that's great. I think the main thing I'm railing against is that it's viewed uncritically as the main game in town. And, you have to argue. Like I had to spend like 40% of my paper arguing for my methods. You don't do that in a quantitative paper. You just go, boom, I ran a study, here's the numbers, right? So that's the metaphilosophical problem. If we all got humbled a bit and we're like, these methods, mixed methods, yes, I love that. Let's triangulate on these questions. Some things might translate quite nicely to quantitative, but if it was viewed with a humility of like, of course, quantitative questions, I'm baking in some of my theory into the questions. It's imperfect, but it can serve to get at this angle or that. I think that's amazing. And so I think the future XFi is not qualitative all the way down, nor should it be quantitative, but whatever methods make the most sense for whatever given project. But anytime there's just kind of like a gold standard, we should be suspicious of gold. That's the gold standard where you have to argue to get into a journal because you're using a different method. Not going to be good. But yeah, you put it better than I did. Go rewind, listen to what Lance just said.
There's lots of good stuff there. I should say I had exactly that experience. I felt the necessity in my dissertation, because it includes both a qualitative, like it's very mixed methods, and it has quantitative chapters at the tail end, and then in the middle there's a big chunk of the qualitative stuff. It's like the first part of the it's like I spend many pages saying, here's why a qualitative approach works for this, why it's important, why triangulation on these questions using multiple methods is important, but why this component is critically important. And like, I have to make the point. I'm like, look, there are cases where the only way to find out if a quantitative method is valid or not is with qualitative methods. You can't just do quantitative, quantitative, quantitative. And if the qualitative method convincingly shows that the quantitative method doesn't work, on what grounds are you just going to presume and like just insist quantitative is better, when I'm like, but the qualitative data shows pretty definitively that the qualitative method in this context does not work. How are you going to tell me it doesn't work? Yeah. So what I have to do is I have to say, this is a possibility, and that quantitative researchers need to take it seriously. And I think my arguments there are convincing, but I didn't even need anybody to tell me that I needed to do that. I knew I needed to do that. Yeah. And my suspicion is that people reading that will go, I'm still not convinced. It's still, this is just crappy quality. It's just subjective. Maybe you're just biased. And what I tell people is, if you think I didn't code the open response questions in a way where the response rates are as low as I'm claiming they are, and in some cases it's like outrageously low, the number of people that interpreted them as intended, it's like 2% or 10% or whatever. Yeah. Look at the data yourself. You tell, because if anything, in a lot of these cases, I have to point out, like, I think I might actually be too generous in some of my interpretations. Yeah. And I still get these low rates. And so if you don't agree, I would love to do adversarial coding with people. They're welcome to look at it. Yeah. And it's the same thing as you were saying with the, read the 200 pages, and I think you'll come away with the same impression. I think if people spent as much time as I did, which was, no one will, but like dozens of hours reading and rereading and rereading the open response questions from people, that like, I think people would have a very similar takeaway, which is something like, whoa, most of these people are not interpreting these questions the way you would want them to if you had a valid measure. There's something off here. I don't know how anyone could not come away with that impression.
I agree.
So anyway, so that's the last I have to say. So I guess I'll leave it to you to say a final word before we wrap up, because we don't want to hit that, and we're about to hit the 2-hour mark. So I'll leave it to you to talk about whatever else, final closing remarks, and to let people know about like what else you might be working on, or where they could find your work, or if there's anything of interest that you want to share that's relevant to this.
I'm looking at what my website is. I think it's, I should know this. No, I just want to thank you. This was fantastic. I love having these conversations. I'm working on finishing up the free will one, and I'm planning one with a colleague to look at whether people have a view of computationalism when they think about human minds and machines. So very invested in this like qualitative approach. But yeah, I'm just really thankful to have this conversation. Appreciate you bringing me on. My website, which has my email, yes, it has my email, is ktompsonphilosophy.com. Probably needs an update, but if anyone wants to reach out, send me a message with a question, hate mail, whatever, I'll take it all. Really looking forward to seeing where this channel goes, and you've been doing some great work. So
awesome, thank you. And I'll put a link in the description for that if you're cool with that. And cool, we will leave it there. And all right, so thanks everybody for joining us for this conversation. And I am going to close it out. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, leave comments. I like to engage with people myself. If you want to engage with people in the comments, you're welcome to do it. But I jump in there and I get all involved in the comments. So whatever you want to do, thanks everybody, and I will see y'all later.